Please,
Thank
sir,
you
have
very
the floor.
much. Greetings all, respectful greetings to all. I'm very honored to be here with all of you and enjoyed the previous statements and agree with many of them. We're talking about gaps. My presentation is focusing on indigenous peoples, and which I think is important as we talk about the WSIS process. We're also involved in the Sustainable Development Goals post-2015, and there is this talk of technology and communications within that process to help alleviate poverty, et cetera. So this particular subject is important to indigenous peoples. So we've been participating in the WSIS process from the very beginning. There's a number of declarations online. We're very, very active even up into Paris in 2013. So let me just begin by saying for many indigenous peoples, whether in developed or developing countries, they are still distinctly disadvantaged with regard to access to and distribution of digital information. Additionally, indigenous peoples and others are often disadvantaged in terms of literacy or the skills-based capacities required for the effective utilization of ICTs. Commenting on the barriers many Ainu children experience, for example, with regard to ICTs, a community member stated, in order for our children to participate on an equal level with the leaders of the future, they need to have the same access and training with computers and the internet as children from all other countries. Considering the diversity of indigenous peoples, however, the digital disadvantage is not always simply a question of lack of access. For some indigenous peoples, ICTs represent a vulnerability to further colonization, and it's a threat to the vitality of their cultures, languages, and religions. There's also a concern over the lack of protections for traditional knowledge, intellectual property, and the collective guardianship over their resources. Affecting attitudinal barriers towards ICTs requires more than innovative and creative approaches. It requires a level of trust attainable with the adequate protections and safeguards of indigenous peoples' rights, including the full and effective participation of communities involved in the projects that affect them. Implementing international instruments and processes along with the WSIS outcomes can play an important role in promoting protections, safeguards, and standards. Let me just go to some of our recommendations that we've presented previously, and they're still pretty pertinent at this point. They're congruent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and supported by many other international instruments. The first one is foster policies and projects that enable indigenous approaches to ICTs that are with them and by them instead of just for them. And there's many times people come to do things for indigenous peoples, but folks are not really working with, and they're not really listening to projects that can be conducted by them. The second is there needs to be a consideration for all types of ICTs, including radio, TV, telecommunications, and service design and development, and that could be increased. That could increase the engagement of some indigenous peoples. So policies and programs should emphasizing assessing and scaling applications that are already benefiting indigenous peoples. E-government, e-community initiatives should be extended. National and international e-strategies should have a specific indigenous peoples focus when these strategies are being developed in areas where they reside. Providing alternative ways for indigenous peoples to access e-services should also be a priority. Fostering policies and programs that promote media pluralism with a focus on indigenous media is also important. So developing programs and policies that support sustainable indigenous media development, ensuring adequate protection of traditional knowledge and the safety of indigenous journalists, remove policies that deny indigenous peoples access and control of communications networks and frequencies, and support to indigenous media initiatives. Another recommendation is long-term goals need to include long-term support strategies. Long-term support for capacity building, secure sustainable funding resources, as well as ongoing monitoring and evaluation need to be prioritized. And finally, there should be encouraged research should be encouraged to address the lack of disaggregated data concerning indigenous peoples and ICTs. Accurate measurements of ICT adoption, usage, and impacts among indigenous peoples are needed to aid policymakers and program developers make well-informed decisions. Strategies to mainstream findings across sectors should also include consultations, deployment, policies, and programs inclusive of indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very